but not being as eloquent as Chuck Todd. I'll move on. So today we have a couple of firsts. This is the wrap-up seminar for the winter quarter here, and we have two firsts, I think, one for all time and one for this quarter, as I think this is the first jointly sponsored Center for International Security and Cooperation Precourt Institute for Energy seminar. We hope to do many more in the future. We thank Professor Ewing for agreeing to this. This was actually, I think, discussed as early as last August or something. Then it took a while to do the scheduling. The second, more festive and short term, is we will have, I think, the first reception right immediately after out front. So you'll have more time to talk informally between each other and with our special guest for today. So without taking too much time on the front end here, I'd like to introduce our very prestigious speaker, Professor Rod Ewing, who many of us know as on this side of campus as a professor of geophysics in the School of Earth, Environment, and Energy Sciences. I have to get all those elements in now. It used to just be the School of Earth Sciences in simpler times, but he is also, very importantly, the Frank Stanton Professor of Nuclear Security, which I may have heard about someplace in the news in the last little bit. I'm not too sure about that. And co-director of the Center for International Security and Cooperation. One of his many activities is putting together could I call it a tribunal on what to do about what he calls the back end, or people who know him call the back end of the nuclear fuel cycle, namely post-use processing and storage, disposal, et cetera. I see a nice mix of Mike May, one of my current and former more active colleagues here for this. So I think it's going to be a very interesting session. So I'd like to turn it over now to Rod to talk about the work of this review committee, tribunal, whatever you want to call it. Thank you.
Thank you. Is it on? Yes. Yeah, great. So it's a pleasure to be here, and it's a pleasure to combine the seminars from CSAC with the energy seminar from Precourt. I want to start by pointing out that we've just passed the 75th anniversary of the Chicago Pile 1 experiment, where Enrico Fermi and his colleagues demonstrated that it was possible to have a sustained chain reaction. This is a painting that depicts this historic event. And this was really the culmination of all of the exciting physics that took place early in the 20th century. It was a crude reactor, but still large enough, some 45,000 carbon blocks for the moderator, some 5 metric tons of uranium, and 45 metric tons of UO2 as the fuel. And this was just over 75 years ago. And I put this up because I'm sure at this historic moment in physics, no one said, well, what about the waste, right? There was so much excitement that this idea worked. And of course, this was quite an important development because this led then to the creation of the plutonium production reactors at Hanford and then at Savannah River. Heralded the beginning of the use of nuclear reactions for generating power. And so this was a big moment, but people weren't thinking about the waste. Now, in fact, there were waste. CP1 was disassembled and moved to a site not too far away from the present location of Argonne National Laboratory. It was decided that perhaps having such a nuclear reactor so close to downtown Chicago wasn't the most prudent approach, so it was moved. Reassembled as CP2, there were a series of reactors, And in fact, at this site A, plot M, the material from the reactor, or at least part of the material from the reactor, is buried. Okay, so this was, in fact, some of the waste and its ultimate fate going back 75 years ago. This was the subject of a cleanup, a modest cleanup, which took several tens of millions of dollars. This is at Redgate Woods, I think it's called, just a 5-minute drive from the present Argonne National Laboratory. More interesting is Building 51 of the Malincrot Chemical Works, which were located essentially in downtown St. Louis. It was in this building that the rich uranium ore from the Belgian Congo was processed and generated some 40 metric tons of uranium for Fermi's CP1. Okay? This processing facility continued to operate until 1957, and the residues from this processing actually moved around the local area of St. Louis. Some fraction were stored at the airport for a while. And I'm not sure of the entire story, but in fact, some portion of this waste ended up in a landfill in North St. Louis County. And that landfill is on fire, an underground fire. And you can imagine there's some concern from the local community. In fact, you don't need to imagine that concern. There's a very nice HBO documentary, Atomic Homefront, which traces the history of this landfill issue, the radioactivity in the landfill, and how the communities have struggled to deal with the cleanup. So I think for me, what's very important to realize is that, you know, I went to the University of Chicago and participated in the celebration of CP1. At that time, I didn't realize that some of the waste is still confounding the efforts of local communities in St. Louis, and that people still struggle with this waste. Now, that was the first step. CP1 was very small. It operated at less than a watt. But we had an extensive weapons program with plutonium production reactors, reprocessing to reclaim that plutonium. 1957, Shippingport power plant came online. First commercial nuclear power plant, and we began to, as a country, create used or spent nuclear fuel as a waste product of the fuel cycle. So the scale of this experiment is small, but what followed later was huge. I found it doesn't do much good to give you the numbers in curies or cubic meters or gallons or the normal metrics, but dollars perhaps are closer to your hearts when you're making comparisons. And we can consider, roughly speaking, that the Department of Energy's budget is about $30 billion. Most recently, it's a little higher. In that $30 billion, if we set aside the $12 billion that goes to NNSA, essentially the weapons program, this leaves $18 billion in the Department of Energy's budget left to do whatever a Department of Energy should do. That is, look into alternative sources of energy, you know, do the work, the research and the development, and provide the support for developing alternative or new energy resources. So that's $18 billion. But if you look at, when we look at the Department of Energy's budget, you'll see $6 billion for environmental management. environmental management is that part of DOE that's dealing with the legacy waste from our defense programs. So that's 1/3 of, let's say, the usable budget for energy. And that $6 billion is more than the budget for the Office of Science. The Office of Science is the largest supporter of research for the physical sciences in the United States, larger than the NSF. And yet we spend more money working on finding solutions for this defense waste. That says nothing about the waste generated by nuclear power plants. We'll come to that in a moment.
I have a quick question about that.
Could you ask me questions at the end? I'd appreciate it. Please.
I know what you mean by waste, that's all.
Yeah, I'll look forward to your questions at the end. Okay, so with this in mind, what I want to present to you today is the result of a series of meetings that occurred at Stanford and then one meeting at George Washington University, where we tried to identify particular issues that were very important to getting the U.S. nuclear waste management program back on track. The meetings occurred over a nearly 2-year period. We were very fortunate to have support from Precourt, also support from the Friedman-Spogli Institute for International Studies, and support from CSAC to conduct these meetings. And this allowed us to bring in experts from essentially all over the world. And in this series of five meetings, we had 75 presentations and lots of time for interaction and discussion. And there's let's say a longer description of the purpose for these meetings, but the short description is we wanted to understand why the U.S. program is not advanced, and we wanted to try to avoid that in 20, 30, or 40 years, we're still discussing the same issues. That is, to identify the way forward. Now, the U.S. program is represented, in my mind, by this Gordian knot. The program is ever tightening. We've arrived at this state due to major changes in the original law, the Nuclear Waste Policy Act in 1982, slowly developing and changing regulatory framework, erratic funding, significant changes in policy with changing administrations, conflicting congressional and executive policies, and finally, inadequate public engagement in decisions about fundamental strategies for the storage, transportation, and disposal of the nuclear waste. Now, there are many strands in this knot. One could focus on the implementer, the Department of Energy, or on the regulator, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, or on the states, which are either against receiving a repository or perhaps want to have a repository. But I want to emphasize really everyone in this field, including myself, has contributed to this knot. Now, my main role has been in a researcher, let's say far removed as a researcher, far removed from the policy. But in fact, as I look back, I think that the researchers, including myself, have focused too much on what I call just the piecemeal science. We have a small contract, we measure the solubility of thorium under certain conditions. We haven't been following our data and our thoughts into the safety analysis. We haven't really contributed as much as we should have to thinking about the conceptual problems of nuclear waste management and disposal. Now, why does the United States find itself in this current situation? There's a very long list, but just some high points. First, managing the spent fuel and high-level waste wasn't a high priority. In the earliest days, during the Cold War, It was more important to produce weapons than to worry about the waste. And also there was real optimism associated with nuclear power, and I would say a naive belief that it would be easy to dispose of the used fuel, or that that used fuel would be reprocessed. In the earliest days, reprocessing was part of the plan, and reprocessing was considered to be a strategy which would reduce the waste problem. Also, there was a technical fix could be envisioned. The simplest technical fix in terms of the reprocessing associated with nuclear weapons was just to build enormous tanks and put the high-level waste into the tanks and leave it. And if the tank leaked or if we needed more storage space, build additional tanks. And that was the fix for a long time. And then the Atomic Energy Commission did begin to worry about it, so they commissioned a study of the National Academy of Sciences, which in 1957 endorsed the idea of geologic disposal. It's a very nice report, criteria. It looks like something that can be done. And so this report added to the idea or the feeling that technical fixes were available. Now, as time passed, it turned out that the technical fix was not as easy as expected. The tanks leaked, as an example. It's difficult to detect the tanks when they're leaking. Probably more important, in 1969, there was a fire at Rocky Flats. And that fire caused the Atomic Energy Commission to think more seriously about what are our options, where are we going to put the waste, because a large amount of the waste from Rocky Flats was sent to Idaho with a promise to the governor of Idaho that 10 years later, that waste would be sent to another location. Okay? And so one needed another location. That was in the 70s, in early 70s and late 70s. There was an interagency group that very carefully considered what might be done. And this led to the Nuclear Waste Policy Act of 1982, which was really a grand covenant. Okay? There was a lot of interaction, a lot of different ideas, a lot of give and take, and it plotted the path forward for the US program. The difficulty is that almost immediately some of these key bargains began to unravel. One of the most important elements of this bargain was that the site selection for a repository would be technically driven and involve the comparison of at least 3 possible sites. In the period between 1982 and 1987, this site selection process went from 9 to 5 and finally to 3 sites that were placed under active investigation. But in 1987, Congress, let's say frustrated by the cost of characterizing 3 sites when you only need 1, decided on Yucca Mountain as the site for further investigation. Another element of the difficulty is that yesterday's solutions have become today's problems. This is a quote from a DOE colleague who prefers to remain anonymous. But it's very interesting to consider how along the way things were done that looked like solutions. An example would be the removal of cesium and strontium from the waste in the Hanford tanks. So now we have several thousand pipes, capsules of cesium and strontium that were separated from the high-level waste at Hanford. This was probably a good idea, and I've always been impressed by the fact that it could be done and was done. But it creates a new waste stream. And these capsules are in pools in storage at Hanford and represent yet another issue that has to be dealt with. Another type of solution, particularly in the late 80s and through the 90s, was to enter into agreements with states about the fate of the waste on their site. So most famous would be the 1989 agreement, the tri-party agreement between the state of Washington, EPA, and DOE, which deals with what to do with the waste at Hanford. Well, at the moment this was signed in 1989, it looked like progress. But that schedule was very specific about what would be done and when and what penalties might accrue to DOE if they didn't finish the work on time. Another agreement in 1995, DOE agreed with the state of Idaho that in 40 years, all of the spent fuel would be removed from the state of Idaho. Well, 1995, we're pretty far along to the 2035 date when that's supposed to happen. And so the solutions became actually a web of agreements that in many ways tied DOE's hands as they tried to look forward to a new solution. And then finally, no geologic repository. Central to all of this is a place to put the waste. In 2010, the Obama administration attempted to withdraw the license application unsuccessfully, and that took some years in court to determine. But being unsuccessful in withdrawing the license application, funding for the NRC and the DOE to pursue work on Yucca Mountain was not available. And so these are just a few of the items that really blocked progress on nuclear waste management. Now for the reset process, let me say just, and very quickly, a few words about that. The entire process was driven by a steering committee of people who have extensive experience with nuclear waste management issues. It included people from national laboratories. I have to say, with the change in administration and also change in lab management, they finally had to step off, but they made a very important contribution to the discussions. Probably most important were the international members of the committee, representing Sweden, Canada, and France. We also had then people from academics, and Sally Benson from Precord Institute. What I'd say, I added it up, this is over 300 years experience in the nuclear waste field. And so that's just one way to say we, in our deliberations, weren't limited to what we were told. We didn't enter the discussion as novices, but it guided the discussions and the design of the meetings. The steering committee set the agenda, and at the first meeting, we spent a lot of time trying to determine what are the critical issues. There's so many little issues. We don't want to waste time on those, although they might be very important. What are the most important issues to address? This is the list of important issues. The idea of a new waste management organization, the definition of a consent-based process. I should have said earlier, we benefited greatly from the Blue Ribbon Commission on America's Nuclear Future, right? So those first two issues come really from their deliberations and their report, which was issued in January of 2012, and thus far there's been no action on those reports. Other issues for the committee were to understand the nuclear waste, the back end of the fuel cycle in the United States, to review how regulations and risk methodology are folded into the concept of safety. And then also very important was the idea of, well, what if we do nothing? We found we didn't know much about the no action option for the US program. And that's a very important starting point. And so we put it on our list, but the open circle means that we didn't get to this subject, and I'll come back to that later. What we did do is organize meetings around each of these items. And for each of the meetings, say in the new organization, I won't read through all of these or even give you time to finish reading them, we would have a series of questions, and then we would invite speakers most appropriate for addressing the questions. For the new organization, that had been, and you'll see in a moment, or I'll describe to you in a moment, it's a topic with a long history. And so we focused on areas that hadn't been covered so thoroughly before, such as what do we mean when we say that an organization should engender trust? What kind of behavior is that? Or if we say an organization doesn't have trust, what do we mean exactly? Okay? For the integration of the fuel cycle, we were most interested to understand whether the incentives at every stage were aligned in such a way that you would be led to geologic disposal. And as you'll see as I discuss this, in fact, in the US, they're not aligned. And we fragment the problem so that in the United States right now, there's a lot of discussion of extended interim storage, as if that's a solution, but that may be a solution that becomes tomorrow's problem. Public engagement, what does the consent-based process mean? Who gives consent? How do you enter into such an agreement? Most importantly, how do you get out of a consent agreement? How do you withdraw your consent? And what if things change in a big way? What if you have a repository, everyone's been on board, but the implementer decides, well, I would like to use that repository for an entirely different type of waste. This has happened at the waste isolation pilot plant in New Mexico. So a process of actually obtaining consent over a 20-year period is now negated by rather rapid changes in the purpose for the repository. That is, it's being changed. And then the critical issues of risk, regulations, and safety. Of course, this is what the public is most interested in, but how do we take risk calculations and convey them to the public and to ourselves in a way that they make sense and make a compelling case? And then, as I mentioned, this issue of the status quo, which we didn't get to, but I want to discuss in a moment. All right, I can discuss everything in a lot of detail, and I want to do that in a moment, but let me just give you what the recommendations are, and then I'll go back through them and give a little bit of history and the thinking of the committee. The first is to create a new nuclear waste management organization, and most importantly, a new funding scheme. I'll come to that in the later discussion. But what's new is the idea that this organization would be utility owned, okay? And in all of the long history of considering various types of organizations that might deal with the nuclear waste, what finally stood out to the committee is that if we look around the world, say in Canada, Switzerland, Finland, and Sweden, the nuclear waste organization, single purpose organization, is owned by the utilities. And this has a very important effect because that means that you've aligned all of the decision-making steps within one organization, and they're oriented toward the goal of long-term disposal, that is, the geologic repositories. The third conclusion is just to follow, recommendation is just to follow on, that we have to find a way in the US program to align all of the incentives. Right now, the Nuclear Waste Policy Act put into place what's called the standard contract, which is an agreement between the Department of Energy and the utilities about how the fuel will be transferred to the department. But in the absence of a repository, and the Department of Energy's failure to take ownership of that fuel and dispose of it in a repository, that leads the utilities to take actions with that fuel on site that may not be aligned with what needs to be done for geologic disposal. We would also recommend revising the regulatory approach such that the quantitative probabilistic risk analysis is only one element in what we describe as a safety case approach. And this is a very important recommendation, but it'll take me some time to tease out the subtleties of it. And then the final observation is that, our recommendation or admonition is that we have to realize with nuclear waste management and disposal, it's not just a technical issue, okay? This is an issue, whether you like it or not, that also has a huge societal component. And whatever the solution is, it has to be something that communities, states, and the larger politic find acceptable. And I'll dwell on that a little more as we go. Okay, a few words on nuclear waste management organization. Well, the idea of a new nuclear waste management organization is not at all new. This is a quote from a very early book on radioactive waste, recommending a radioactive waste authority. Actually, the Atomic Energy Commission, the Atomic Energy Act of 1946 established that the federal government would be responsible for the nuclear waste. A promulgated regulation by the AEC in 1970 put the federal government in charge of developing a geologic repository. The Nuclear Waste Policy Act of 1982 tells the Secretary of Energy to look at alternative organizations. And so in 1983, the Secretary of Energy formed AMFM, Alternative Management and Financing of the Management of Nuclear Waste. That commission worked for a time, looked at different organizations, Fed Corps, private corporations, and so on. Finally, their report wasn't received very well by the Department of Energy, and it was decided, well, even if this is a good idea, let's wait until we have the, we're past the site recommendation stage, okay? Which we haven't, which we got to in 2002, and the Department of Energy never returned to this subject. The Blue Ribbon Commission went through the process again and decided that the best approach was a Fed Corp, as they're called, a federally chartered corporation, wholly owned by the federal government. There's been no action on that. In 2012, actually a bipartisan committee in Congress submitted legislation that would create a nuclear waste management organization, not a Fed Corp, but an independent government agency and so on. There was no action taken. In 2015, it was submitted to Congress again, and again, no action. So it's just by way of saying there's a long history here. Now, what are we recommending? First, it's very important to realize, and it becomes clearer as we march through the recommendations, central to the success of the program would be a new, independent, single-purpose national organization. The BRC, the Blue Ribbon Commission, recommended a Fed Corp. So I've already said we think there's great value in looking carefully at the possibility of a utility-owned corporation that's responsible for the entire fuel cycle, from the generation of spent fuel until its final disposal. There are a lot of elements that are required. Some are on everyone's list that discusses this matter. You must create trust. We have to realize that such a corporation operates over a long period of time. The active process of emplacing waste, that will take over 100 years. There has to be considerable public engagement and scrutiny, regular national and international reviews. What's most interesting for the US case is to think about, well, what nuclear waste? The immediate idea was, well, this new corporation would be in charge of everything, the defense waste, the commercially generated spent fuel. The problem with that is the defense waste, it's a huge problem, and the Department of Energy has already entered into a web, and I've described them briefly before, of agreements. And so it would be a horrible thing for a new organization to walk into that web. And so I think the preference of most members of the committee is to say, let the new nuclear waste management organization only deal with commercially generated spent fuel, because if they were successful with that, that would be a huge accomplishment. That would just be fantastic. And if they are successful, then at a later stage, they could negotiate with the Department of Energy about DOE paying for their high-level waste being disposed of in the repository if that's appropriate. This would also have the curious advantage of giving the U.S. program two programs, one federal, dealing with the defense waste, and the other a utility-owned corporation, essentially private, dealing with the commercially generated spent fuel. I'm going to have to move on. Let me just jump down to funding. Some of these points are important, but in some ways they're just words. The funding situation for nuclear waste in the United States is barely describable. Okay? Initially, it made sense. There's a fee that the ratepayer pays on electricity generated by nuclear power plants, 1 mil per kilowatt hour, and those fees from the ratepayers go into a fund, the nuclear waste fund, from which we then are to develop a repository, transportation systems, and so on. And it's worked. The fund has accumulated well over $35 billion worth of fees, and with interest now, it's at $40 billion. Over $40 billion. The problem is, and I have to refer to my notes because in some ways it's just difficult to believe. The problem is in the 1980s, the Gramm-Rudman-Hollings Act, 1985, treated the nuclear waste fund as income and charged it against the national debt. Okay? And so it's in the mandatory part of the budget where there are mandatory expenditures. There were amendments to the Gramm-Rudman-Hollings Act, as well as the 1990 Budget Enforcement Act, such that they all combined mean that if you want to increase the budget, say for repository research, in order to maintain a balanced budget, then you have to reduce something else in the Department of Energy's budget, even though the ratepayers have already put all the money in. Okay? And so maybe you're in a construction phase and you want to really spend money, get it done. Well, then the Department of Energy would have to cut some other part of its budget in order to provide for that increase. Okay? This essentially means that the funding is erratic, it's not sufficient, and it doesn't scale to what projects experience, that is maybe low levels of funding required early, but then when you start building something, you expect to have more funds available. Okay. So the new organization, if it were entirely the utilities, of course, they could take that fee and put it into, as they do in Sweden, what they call a lockbox, so that the money is still there. But also our recommendation is to transfer to the new organization over a period of 25 years the nuclear waste fund, so that that money which has been collected for waste disposal can be made available. Okay, integration of the back end of the nuclear fuel cycle. Okay, in the 1970s, this is a recent diagram, this is what everyone expected to happen. Okay, you would march around the nuclear fuel cycle, you would have your power plant, fuel would go into storage maybe for 5 years, high-level waste from reprocessing, which the US no longer does, would accumulate. And the reason I like this is it illustrates part of the problem is there's no geologic repository. A geologic repository is part of the fuel cycle, but it's often been an afterthought, as if we can create it and everything will just flow in on schedule. What's happened for the US, of course, is the used fuel from power plants, the high-level waste from defense programs are accumulating at sites all over the country, and it has no place to go. This is the failure of integration. Now, what's the scale of the problem? Well, if all of the US right now has 99 nuclear power plants, and they generate around 2,000, 2,200 metric tons of used fuel per year. If all of the power plants that are scheduled for license extensions, if every power plant gets to its end of life, the total inventory will be close to 140,000 metric tons of fuel. Because the pools at the reactor sites where the fuel was initially stored are filling, this means then fuel has to go into dry cask storage, and over time as pools are shut down and the fuel goes in dry cask storage, finally at the end we will have some 9,000 dry cask storage canisters around the country in approximately 70 different sites. Let me just go on. I just want to give you some examples of what happens if we don't integrate the fuel cycle. A technical example of some of the problems is that we have already 14 shut down sites where there's spent fuel on the site but no operating reactor. Right? But of those 14 sites, 8 have already decommissioned their fuel handling facilities. So the possibility of repackaging, putting things into smaller packages, we've frozen in time the options, right? And that situation will only grow with time. The economic penalty we pay is because the Department of Energy was not able to take ownership of the fuel on January 31st, 1998. The utilities have sued the Department of Energy successfully, and they now receive about $500 million a year to cover the cost of their having to hang on to the fuel. Okay? If nothing changes over the next 10 years, the extrapolation is that'll go to something like $25 billion of expense. Okay? And it comes out of the judgment fund, which has seemingly no limit. Social impact, all of the communities with the stranded fuel sites. There's an environmental impact. You can't do this forever. There's a curious regulatory impact. Previously, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission had a waste confidence, I want to use the word rule, but I think it's a determination, which was used to simply say the Nuclear Regulatory Commission is confident that there will be a repository. And this was part of moving forward with nuclear power plants. Well, this was challenged in court after repeated delays. How confident can you be? And so now there's a waste storage rule, which essentially consists of a generic analysis that says in 60 years and 160 years and even beyond, there's not much environmental impact. That may or may not be true. People argue about that. But what's certain is that type of ruling removes any incentive to go from storage to disposal. And so you see the US system kind of breaking into parts where each part will continue as is without getting to the final goal of disposal. For the nuclear industry, there are implications. As an example, let's say we're moving fuel. Originally, people thought they would move the oldest fuel first. Now, people say, well, let's move the hottest fuel, or let's move the fuel at the stranded sites. That's the higher priority because it costs so much to secure those sites. From a geologic point of view, depending on the type of rock, actually none of those options may be what's desired. You may want some mixture of fuels to arrive at a certain temperature. All of this is by way of saying that if we make these decisions separately or separate from one another, then we'll always be less than we should. I'm just watching the clock a little bit. Okay, that's why I flipped through some things, sorry. Public engagement, consent-based siting. Over the last 50 years, there have been 24 efforts to site a geologic repository, and 5 had succeeded. And this reference from the Nuclear Waste Technical Review Board describes the history of those efforts. And one of the conclusions is that actually to be successful, you need a site that's not only technically suitable, but you need one that's socially acceptable. And the dark areas refer to the time period as you get closer and closer to making a decision. So as you know more about the site, then these circles would decrease, but they've certainly got to overlap. Doesn't matter what you do first, looking at history. You can get a technically acceptable site first, or you can take the other route, as the Canadians are doing, and look for something that's socially acceptable. Public engagement. The 2 points that have been missed in previous discussions are that the key words are trust and power. The implementer has to have trust, and nothing builds trust more than redistributing the power so that everyone has a moment in which they can make their views felt and pass judgment on the acceptability of different strategies. And so what we've proposed is first to realize that consent-based siting is a process. In the US, up until now, it's often described as a legally binding contract. Well, we have lots of those with the states, and those are now part of the web that's holding everything in place. But in fact, looking at other countries that have been successful with the consent-based process, it's really a process. You have to have early engagement. You're at it all the time. Whether you have an agreement or not doesn't matter so much as you're able to communicate with the community, with the state, and change your plans. Okay? That's been one of the difficulties in the US program, is we haven't been able to adjust. Now, how would this be done? Looking at other countries, it's not so complicated. It would mean that, as an example, a community or a state might have a veto up until a certain point, say the point where the license application is submitted. They would be an integral part of the site investigation. They would follow along to a certain point, and then their right to veto would disappear when the license operation begins, or the license application process begins. In some countries, the veto exists up until the work goes underground. In other countries, the veto could be at some point during the underground characterization of the repository. A very important point is there are many ways to do it, but this is something that has to be negotiated with the communities. That's an essential part of the process, is to get everyone on the same page and to agree as to how this might be done. Now, there can be a provision to overrule local objections. A typical way to imagine doing this is with a supermajority of both houses of Congress. But then, of course, you have to define exactly what you mean by supermajority. And in fact, this happened with the old Nuclear Waste Policy Act when Congress overturned the veto by the state of Nevada for going forward with Yucca Mountain. Okay? And if you look at the numbers, I'd forgotten them, I went back and looked last night. Actually, it was a supermajority if you define supermajority as being 60% of each of the houses of Congress. Okay. I think I've said these things, so let me get on to the last topic, which is the regulations. Now, the regulations in this field are, it's a whole subject unto itself. This is a short list of the major activities or major points along the way to developing a regulation. I'll simply point out that the NRC was established in 1974 when I got my PhD. Okay? We're down at the end. I'm still talking about nuclear waste. And so this whole process of establishing a regulatory framework has taken my whole career. And it's not done yet. Okay? That's probably not fast enough if we want to proceed. The other point is that there are some major points, major steps along the way, and probably the most important was an Academy report which set the technical basis for what became the Yucca Mountain standard. And what I'll simply tell you is the standard has evolved. The original Yucca Mountain Stanford standard was site-specific, just for Yucca Mountain. That's important. Risk-based. And the compliance period goes out to 1 million years. Okay, so it's risk-based to 1 million years. What could that possibly mean? Okay, risk to whom 1 million years from now? Risk of what? Okay, and yet, for different reasons, and I think I understand the reasons, following different roads, we've converged on pretty difficult requirements for understanding the concept of safety. And in fact, the Yucca Mountain Standard, remanded several times, and this was the EPA's last effort, and it's still probably subject to discussion in court, has a 50 millirem limit the first 10,000 years, but then that jumps to 100 millirem, the units don't matter, from 10,000 years to 1 million years. So go home and try to discuss with your spouse or your children what that might mean in terms of safety. That's one of the critical difficulties. And I'm going to skip some of the details of explaining how this works for the U.S. and simply say that the recommendation by the committee is to use what is called a safety case approach. Now, this is difficult to discuss because in the U.S. they picked up on the word safety case and it can mean something different. This is a definition from the IAEA, the NEA. But essentially, a safety case approach is multiple lines of evidence, a compelling argument, of which among those multiple lines of evidence are the probabilistic risk assessments. Now, why is this important? And I'm not sure I can explain it quickly or concisely enough. The safety case really is a compelling argument. To have a compelling argument, when you select a site, you have to know why you think the site is safe, right? That there's no volcanoes, stable tectonic regime, low movement of water, slow movement of water through the rock units. So the safety case, by weaving this compelling argument, is one that has to be consistent with, or should be consistent with, the site selection criteria. Also, the safety case approach means that as long as you have a compelling argument, you can reasonably say, well, our calculations out to 100,000 years, that's about as far as we would like to carry that line of argument. That's the limits of our abilities today. But in terms of very long-term stability, in Switzerland they even go beyond 1 million years, we can make strong, qualitative but compelling arguments for safety. And this has the important effect that it could be then that the regulation in terms of quantitative analysis should be for a relatively short period of time. Or the regulation might say, for relatively short periods of time, no release, right? And there could be a strong deterministic or probabilistic argument to support those statements, but then that would be part of a larger discussion, this compelling argument. Okay. Okay, so we're back. I've briefly touched on each of the recommendations. Now let me reflect on them and think about what to do with them. How do we move forward? Well, we could accept the recommendations. It would be a heavy lift. Change now and start over for the U.S. Now that would mean the nuclear utilities would take ownership of the fuel and responsibility for its disposal. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission would change their regulatory framework, and on and on and on. It's really a heavy lift, but it's probably what's required. As we look at other countries and how they have been successful, the heavy lift is probably what's required. But today, I don't see Congress taking such deliberate or thoughtful action. The other alternative is, well, let's just do Yucca Mountain, right? The difficulty there is that will be a long and tortuous process, and no matter the outcome, in fact, the DOE's description of this as an unworkable solution may be right. So we could spend a long time fighting over it, and even if Yucca Mountain became the repository, imposing that on a state, having so much disagreement over decades, somehow that looks like failure, right? That's not really the way one wants to succeed when we site nuclear facilities. So again, I'm speaking for myself, not for the committee, but thinking about it, there might be another way forward. From our meetings, which I haven't described in any detail, what is very impressive to me is that there is common ground. We went out of our way to invite all of the disparate parties, everyone that I've seen argue with others over one point or another, but they behaved very well, they interacted very well, and we had useful discussions. So it can be that there's common ground. So my modest proposal is, while we're stuck with the inability to change everything at once, or an option which may not lead us anywhere, one thing we could do is go back to the fifth recommendation, or the fifth thing that the committee didn't get to do, and that is analyze the no option effect for the U.S. program for the next 200 years. The reason this is important is the next 200 years, that's my grandchildren or great-grandchildren. I can think about that. This analysis wouldn't be something we would ask the Department of Energy to do, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, or any of the institutions, but rather should be funded by a neutral foundation. And it would be an analysis that involves not only the participation of experts in risk analysis, but the many communities that are facing this problem. This would be a collective effort to understand what happens if the U.S. does not do anything for the next 200 years, and map it out. The interactions would be with the state of Nevada, with the local communities, with the national laboratories, with university experts, and so on. It would be a massive effort. It would take several years, but it would get everyone in the room talking about the same things and perhaps on the same page. And I think what is most important to aspire to for the U.S. program is some common sense approaches to a very complicated program. That is, we have to get people together. We need practice in doing that. The whole system up until now has been adversarial, right? Some of my DOE colleagues and friends say, well, I'm an advocate for Yucca Mountain, or I'm an advocate for say for waste isolation pilot plant. Well, in this process, we don't need advocates. We need people thinking about the problem. And it would also be the opportunity to bring the next generation in to the process, because it's clear I'll die before I've accomplished anything in this field. And we've suffered through a lot. I'd like to convey that to the next generation. And I like this photo. These are two students at the reset meeting, meeting representatives from New Mexico and the state of Nevada, just telling them no. And students came to me and said, they just said no. They didn't listen to us. I said, well, that's where we are. You know, that's what's exciting about this field. Your job is not only to be an excellent scientist or engineer, but you have to figure out how to communicate with people who, for good reason in terms of how they've been treated previously, are not very receptive to new ideas. Okay, I've gone over a little bit, but thank you very much.
Let's just take a couple of quick questions and then move out right outside.
And I'll stay for your questions. So.
Yeah. Over there.
In one of your slides, there were a few words that either said or imply that you and your committee are working on an updated set of criteria, for citing a geological site for waste disposal. What are the big improvements of today's criteria when set compared to